The following program was made possible with the support of these sponsors. Pacific Premier Bank. When it comes to your business bank, you should expect a difference, offering businesses and individuals banking solutions with personalized service. And by Riverside County's Business and Community Services, supporting the growth and expansion of business and the community in our region. Our silver sponsors include Altura Credit Union, supporting the community through sponsorship and scholarship opportunities. And Bank of America, helping you find the right products for your business needs with a wide range of solutions. And we would also like to thank our bronze sponsors, the City of Ontario, the business gateway to Southern California. Provident Bank, emphasizing personal service and customer convenience in attending to the financial needs of businesses, individuals, and families. Schools First Federal Credit Union, serving the needs of the educational community throughout California. The KPC Group, pursuing excellence by fulfilling the needs of the people while contributing to the improvement of the community. Our media sponsors include the Inland Empire Business Journal, the official business news publication for Southern California's Inland Empire region, and KOLA 99.9 FM, playing classic hits across Southern California for over 20 years. And finally, our creative sponsor, The Brandsmith, fueling your growth through strategic marketing and creative services.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to be focusing on the Inland Empire economy, where we were entering the pandemic, how the economy has performed during and recovered from the worst effects of the pandemic. So my presentation today is going to be divided into four primary parts. First, I'm going to be giving an update on the spread of the coronavirus in the Inland Empire. The good news is that the picture has been improving since the peak that we saw over the summertime. Just as we've seen the number of cases fall in California, we've seen them fall in the Inland Empire as well. Second, I'm going to be looking at where we stood prior to the outbreak of the coronavirus in the United States. One of our best guides to how the economy is going to recover from the fallout of the pandemic is the type of shape that the economy was in entering the pandemic. And the good news is that the Inland Empire was on very solid ground prior to the outbreak of the pandemic. In the rest of my presentation, I'm going to be looking at what the impact of the fallout from the coronavirus has been on the Inland Empire economy. And I'm going to primarily be looking at the labour market. The good news is that the labour market in the Inland Empire has performed better than the state's labour market. The less good news is that there's still a long way to go before we can return to the employment levels that we had prior to the breakout of the pandemic. And then finally, I'm going to be looking at the real estate picture in the Inland Empire. Just as we've seen nationally and in California, we've seen a very strong rebound in the residential real estate market. And there are some interesting questions for us to ponder about the state of the commercial real estate market in the Inland Empire. So first, I'm going to be, as I mentioned, providing a quick update as to where things stand with respect to the spread of the coronavirus in the Inland Empire. And the good news is that that peak that we saw in the end of July, moving into August, is behind us. And the number of new cases recorded on a daily basis in both Riverside and San Bernardino County has dropped by around about 75%. So given that the primary reason for the economy that we have experienced was the spread of the coronavirus, the good news is that for now, the worst spread of the virus is behind us. And I'm not an epidemiologist, but the hope is that going forward, we won't return to the levels of spread that we saw in both the spring and the summertime. Just as we saw good news with respect to the spread of the coronavirus, we're also seeing good news in relation to the number of deaths that have been recorded in both Riverside County and San Bernardino County. we have seen the number of deaths fall as the spread of the virus has fallen. So thankfully, it seems that for now the worst of the virus is behind us, and we hope that these trends will continue as we head into the winter. Hospitalizations as well, finally, it's just another gauge on how well the Inland Empire has been performing with respect to the virus. Again, we peaked in the middle of the summer, and ever since then the number of hospitalizations related to the coronavirus has been dropping. And this is all good news because, as I mentioned before, the primary reason why economic activity had contracted both nationally in California and in the Inland Empire as well was due to efforts to contain the coronavirus and consumer and people's reaction to the spread of the coronavirus. So if we begin increasingly to enter a world whereby the spread of the virus is contained in the Inland Empire, we would expect to see the economy recover in sync. Okay, so where were we before this tsunami hit us in March of this year? How was the Inland Empire performing at that time with respect to its economy? Well, the good news is that the Inland Empire's economy has been somewhat of a juggernaut since the Great Recession, and this can be viewed in a number of different ways. First, with respect to job growth, we've seen very impressive job growth in the Inland Empire, compared not only to the state of California, but also compared to the neighboring counties in the Southern California region. There are a number of different ways that we can look at this, but in the table that you will see on the right, you can see that from 2018 to 2019, the Inland Empire added jobs at double the rate of the state of California. And this continues a trend which has been occurring over a longer period. Okay, if we look at the expansion of payrolls in the Inland Empire and compare it to California and its neighbors in Southern California, we can see that job growth has occurred at a much faster rate in the Inland Empire compared to these other places since the Great Recession. I'd also like you to sort of cast your eyes to the table on the right, where you can see that over the past 5 years, only the city of San Francisco has seen stronger job growth than the Inland Empire. The city of San Francisco's growth, of course, has been fueled by the tech expansion that has been occurring in the region. But you can see that compared to many other parts or all other major areas within the state of California, over the past 5 years, leading up to 2019, the Inland Empire was outgrowing these places. Prior to the onset of the global pandemic, we also saw that the unemployment rate in the Inland Empire was at generational lows, and another measure of the health of the regional economy can be seen in the growth of the labor force. Labor force is effectively a measure of the number of people who are both working and who are actively looking for work in a given region, and you can see that the growth of the labor force in the Inland Empire has far outpaced the growth that we've seen in California and again other parts of Southern California. Another way that we can gauge the strength of the Inland Empire economy is by looking at its housing market. So what we have seen is that after the hemorrhaging that was caused following the Great Recession, house prices are nearing the level that they stood at during the time of the Great Recession. The good news is that this time house prices are based on solid fundamentals, whereas leading up to the Great Recession, a lot of unwise and borrowing and lending practices were fueling house prices at that time. This time, house prices are growing for the right reasons. Another gauge of the health of the housing market can be by looking at the rental market. And what we see is that both rents have been increasing and vacancies have been decreasing in the Inland Empire, which is a sign of a healthy housing market. The commercial real estate market has been doing great also, again, off those lows which we observed during the Great Recession, over time, the value of commercial permits has been increasing at a steady clip. And yes, they fell a touch in 2019, but the longer term trend is undeniable. Since 2010, we see the value of commercial permits trending up in the Inland Empire, which of course is a measure of the desirability of businesses to invest in physical infrastructure in the region. Typically, we see recessions caused by structural problems in the economy. This was certainly the case during the Great Recession. The way in which the current recession is differentiated from many other recessions that we see is because this is not something which was due to the recession was not due to some structural imbalance in the economy, but was due to the onset of the pandemic. So some people refer to the recession as a mandated recession. There was some exogenous force which created the recession rather than some systematic and endemic problem with the economy itself. But now we're going to take a little look at what some of the economic fallout has been from February and March of this year. The most noticeable impact of the pandemic on the economy can be seen in the labour market. And in the months of March and April this year, we saw nearly 200,000 payroll positions shed in the Inland Empire economy. Now, we have started to see a recovery since this time, thankfully, but there is still some damage which has been sustained in the labour market. So if you would compare the number of people employed in the Inland Empire in August to the number that were employed in the Inland Empire in February, we see 130,000 fewer people employed in August than was the case in February, which is a decline of around about 8%. Now, some sectors have been hit much harder than others. So accommodation and food services have seen the disappearance of nearly 47,000 jobs, which is a contraction of around about 30% in the sector. Other sectors which have seen noticeable contractions include other services, which is a sector that includes, for example, hair and nail salons. The retail sector has been affected, and we've also seen fallout in education and healthcare as well. So the chart on the left here shows that in the months of March and April, as I mentioned, nearly 200,000 jobs were cut in the Inland Empire. And while we saw a pretty significant snapback in June, when nearly 20% of those jobs, nearly 25% I should say, of those jobs returned to the economy, the economic recovery as viewed through the labour market has slowed off since this time. So the months of July and August did see slower job growth. Now, under normal circumstances, adding 11 or 12,000 jobs to the Inland Empire economy in any given month would be great news, but when we have a deficit of 130,000 jobs, we would like that growth to be a little quicker. Now, obviously, what has been holding the labour market back has been the resurgence of COVID cases that peaked in late July and early August, and a lot of the restrictions that were put in place both locally and at the state level. Now, the chart on the right shows the good news, which is that the Inland Empire has performed better than California and neighbouring counties in the region. So whereas the Inland Empire economy or labour market contracted by around about 8%. That same figure in the state of California is around about 10%. Another way in which the Inland Empire has fared better than California and other members of the Southern California community is through the labour force. As I mentioned before, the labour force is a measure of all of those people who are both employed and actively looking for work. And at both the national level and in the state of California, we have seen quite a significant contraction in the labour force. So nationally, there are 5 million fewer people looking for work than was the case in February. In the state of California, that number is around about 900,000 people. And these are people who have become discouraged and stopped looking for work and have left the labour market. In the Inland Empire, we haven't seen an exodus nearly as great as that. And in fact, the labour force in the Inland Empire has remained relatively stable. With respect to the unemployment rate, again, we are coming off generational lows, but the unemployment rate in the Inland Empire is still hovering up at over around about 10%. Again, it's better than the state has been doing, but much higher than where we would like to see it. So one of the noticeable things about the performance of the labour market this year is how it's affected some workers and some categories of workers more than others. And we can look at this by looking at the sectors which have been primarily affected by the labour market fallout. So the hospitality sector, as I mentioned before, a sector which contains food and accommodation services, has seen the biggest fall in jobs following the outbreak of the pandemic. And as this slide shows, the majority of those jobs are concentrated in the restaurant sectors of the economy. Now, the pie charts on the right display the workers in the Inland Empire, or the demographics of the workers in the Inland Empire who typically work in these sectors of the economy. And what they show is that workers in the hospitality sector typically tend to be non-white, so only around about a third of the hospitality sector is made up of white workers. We can also see that the hospitality sector is disproportionately made up of young workers. So workers under the age of 25 account for around a third of all workers in the hospitality sector, and there's a slight skew towards females as well, where we see a slightly larger share of females working in the hospitality industry than we do male workers. We can see a very similar trend in the retail sector of the economy as well. Again, retail is another sector which has been hit disproportionately hard by the fallout from the pandemic. Again, in the Inland Empire, we see a very large non-white labour force, and also, again, the labour force who works in the retail industry in the Inland Empire skews young. Around about a quarter of the workers under the age of 25, and another 45% of the workers in the sector fall between the age of 25 and 44. Again, the split between male and female is pretty even in the industry. And then finally, just to further reinforce this point that the fallout from the labour market has tended to affect some workers more than it has others, we can look at the education and health services sector of the economy. Again, we see a similar story here whereby non-whites make up the majority of the workforce. The age distribution is a little less weighted to that younger cohort of workers under the age of 25, but as you can see in the bottom pie chart there, female workers make up nearly 75% of all workers in the education and healthcare sectors of the economy. So what we can see is that the sectors which have contracted the most as a result of the fallout from the spread of the virus have been sectors which predominantly there have been sectors which are predominantly worked in by non-whites, younger workers, and female workers. So just give you a sense of how this fallout has affected members of the society or members of the Inland Empire, residents of the Inland Empire differently. Another way that we can look at the fallout of the Inland Empire economy is just to look at business activity. In this slide here, what we're doing is measuring sales tax revenue. So this is a proxy for how much spending is taking place in the Inland Empire economy. Now, in the chart on the left of the screen here, what we can see is that by far the biggest contraction has been seen in fuel and services, service stations. And that makes a lot of sense, right? People are driving less, they're consuming less gas, which means they're spending less money on gas. Other notable contraction has occurred in restaurants and hotels. A number of the government restraints on business activity that were put in place did affect restaurants in a disproportionate way. Restrictions on indoor dining has meant that the capacity of restaurants has been severely constrained, which has had, of course, an impact on spending in the sector. So we've seen a big fallout which has affected consumption in different components of the economy, and this slide here tells the picture as of Q2. There are other ways that we can monitor consumption in the Inland Empire, and in this slide here I'm showing how spending has been affected across credit card platforms. So this is data which tracks spending by people on their credit cards, and you can still see that consumption in the Inland Empire is around about 10% lower than it was entering into the pandemic, and that puts the Inland Empire pretty much in line with the state of California. And we would expect this as the labour market has contracted, and especially as some of the effects of the stimulus have worn off, and as the sort of enhanced unemployment benefits that were given to workers by the federal government expired on July 31st. What we've seen is that consumption is taking some time to recover, and it's not quite back where we would like it to be. Okay, how has the real estate market performed in the Inland Empire following the outbreak of the pandemic? Well, the great news is that the housing market has seen an extraordinary snapback. So the chart on the left shows that in Q2, year-over-year sales were down in San Bernardino and Riverside County, but using the sort of data set, or sort of that shows how far the residential real estate market had fallen in Q2, but the chart on the right shows you the extent to which the housing market has recovered since. So what we saw in June, July and August was a quite extraordinary snapback in sales growth within the Inland Empire. Another way that we can see the strength of the housing market, or the rebound in the housing market in the Inland Empire, is to look at home sales. So what we saw was that from April to August, house prices rose by 13% in Riverside County and grew by 8% in San Bernardino County. And in the chart on the right, you can see that house prices in Riverside County have exceeded their Great Recession peaks, and in San Bernardino County we're on the precipice of passing that threshold as well. So what is it that explains the strong bounce back in the residential real estate market in the Inland Empire? There are probably three reasons for this, and the first reason goes back to the discussion that we just had about the labour market. The labour market is disproportionately affecting people who wouldn't fit the typical profile of a home buyer. It's typically affecting people in the lowest paying sectors of the economy, which means that relatively speaking, the higher income earners in the region have fared better as a result of the fallout from the pandemic. So the people who would typically buy homes have been affected the least by the pandemic. The second reason, of course, is that we have historically low interest rates. So as interest rates decrease, the cost of buying a home decreases also, which fuels activity in the residential real estate market. And a third reason is due to inventory. So currently the Inland Empire is particularly constrained in the supply of housing. And when you sort of combine these three factors together, the fact that inventories are running low, the fact that the people who would typically buy a home have been least affected by the fallout from the pandemic, and you throw in low interest rates, you're going to see upward pressure on house prices. Another feature of the fallout from the pandemic has been permits. So while home sales and home prices have rebounded nicely, what we have seen in the short term is a relative contraction in the number of permits that have been issued. Now, in Riverside County, we actually have seen year-to-date growth in the number of residential permits issued. This is year-to-date as of Q2. That was primarily driven by the issue of permits in Q1. There was a contraction in Q2, but that wasn't enough to see the strong level of permitting that was seen in that first quarter of the year. What we did see, though, in San Bernardino County was a contraction in the issuance of permits, residential single-family home permits, that is, of around about 5%. What is striking is when we look at the issuance of multifamily permits. So in Riverside County, we see a contraction of nearly 93% on a year-over-year basis. So even though the issuance of single-family permits was strong in Riverside County in Q2, the number of multifamily permits contracted by nearly 100%. In San Bernardino County, that rate is much lower at around about 40%. But again, we should consider these slides in the context of the discussion we just had about tight supply and tight inventories. The fact that we've had this contraction, particularly in multifamily permits through the first two quarters of this year, is going to create further constraint on supply in the region. And this chart illustrates a very similar point, whereby this time we're looking at construction rather than permitting, but you can see in both San Bernardino and Riverside counties, we did see that contraction in construction in the first two quarters of this year, which again means that houses will be coming onto the market at a slower rate, and in a constrained, tightly supplied market, this is going to create upward pressure on house prices in the near term. Another gauge of the health of the real estate market can be seen in commercial permitting activity. In this slide here, we've measured commercial permitting activity by the value of the commercial permits that have been issued. And what we see is that in the first two quarters of this year, the value of the commercial permits that were issued were considerably down on the same period from a year earlier. So we see a contraction of around about $500 million worth of permits issued over this period. One of the interesting questions surrounding the commercial real estate market is the extent to which changes that have come about in working practices as a result of the pandemic might translate into change in demand for commercial real estate. So one of the most obvious areas where we might see change is with respect to the demand for office space. Over the last 6 months, a number of workers, those who have the ability to work remotely, have been working from home. Now, we've been hearing for 40 years about the trend towards telecommuting and what impact it's going to have on the geography of where people live. And for the most part, these stories over a period of time have been overblown. And the big question is are things going to change this time? Has this grand experiment which we've undertaken going to lead to this practice whereby many more people are working from home on a permanent basis? And if that is the case, that could affect the demand for office space. Now, our base case is that workers, once it is safe to do so, and hopefully in the near term, if the pandemic is behind us, many workers will be returning to the office. The retail sector is a different question. Obviously, we've seen secular changes over the last 20 years with the rise in e-commerce. Now, that trend has been accelerated over the last 6 months as more people have been purchasing goods online than would normally be the case. So the retail real estate market, which has been under significant pressure for the last 10 years or so, we can expect that trend to continue if sort of a more amplified shift to e-commerce endures once the pandemic is behind us. Okay, so where does this leave us? Now, the purpose of this presentation has been to point out that prior to the outbreak of the pandemic, the structural balance of the Inland Empire economy was sound. Again, this was not a recession that was caused by some exuberance or some endemic or systemic problem that we had with the economy, either nationally, in California, or in the Inland Empire. And that gives us hope that the bounce back from the recession is going to be much quicker than we've seen in most other recessions. We have seen a strong bounce back in the residential real estate market, and to a lesser extent in consumption also. For as long as interest rates stay as low as they are, and for as long as we see constrained supply, this will continue to put upward pressure on house prices in the Inland Empire. With respect to consumption, consumption activity is ultimately going to be tied to the health of the labour market. The quicker we can get everybody back working to the level that they were prior to the pandemic, back where we were in February, the quicker we'll see the recovery in consumption. One slight dark cloud relates to the labour market. While we did see a strong bounce back in June, we have seen the growth of jobs again throughout the economy, whether that's nationally in California or the Inland Empire, slow since this time. So we've dug ourselves sort of halfway out of the hole, but there's still some ways to go before we can get back just to the level that we were in February of this year. Now, most economists will tell you that employment is a lagging variable, and that as other aspects of the economy improve, we should expect to see employment follow in sync. But that is, of course, no help to the people who have been disproportionately affected by the fallout from the labour market. So as we saw, this labour market fallout has predominantly affected non-white workers, lower income workers generally, and women and younger members of the workforce also. Now, we should not expect to see a full recovery of the labour market until sometime in 2022. Again, in the Inland Empire, we have a deficit of around about 130,000 jobs right now. We added 12,000 jobs in the most recent month. At that pace, it would take another 10 months from now, which would take us out to around about August of next year, just to return to where we were in February of this year. So the recovery in the labour market isn't going to be as quick as we might like. With respect to the commercial real estate market, again, we just spoke about this, but the big questions relate to whether there is going to be some sort of structural shift in the demand for commercial real estate. And as we suspect, the bigger impact is likely to be on retail real estate. Anyway, with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to answering any questions you have during the Q&A session. Thank you.